Alexander Sterling, the cold billionaire known for crushing deals and freezing hearts, had never expected to see warmth in his pristine mansion, but tonight, he walked in on his maid dancing, spinning with a freedom he had long forgotten existed. She moved like the world outside the walls didn't matter, her laughter hidden behind soft hums, and for a fleeting moment, the icy grip around his heart faltered. But why was a girl like her smiling so boldly in a place so cold and controlled? Who was she beneath the apron and quiet obedience, and what secret spark made him feel something he hadn't felt in years? Could a single dance melt a heart built on loss, grief, and betrayal, or was this just the beginning of a storm he never saw coming? The mansion was vast, every corner gleaming with polished marble and towering bookshelves filled with rare volumes, a testament to Alexander's empire. He had built Sterling Industries from the ground up after his parents' tragic deaths left him with nothing but a fierce ambition. Yet wealth had not healed him. It had only deepened his isolation. Leela, his daughter, slept soundly upstairs in a room too large for a child, adorned with silk curtains and hand-carved toys, a world built for comfort but devoid of warmth. Alexander's late wife, Emily, had once filled that mansion with laughter. But her sudden death in a car accident 10 years ago had left only silence. And with it, his heart had frozen. Sophie, on the other hand, carried the weight of a different kind of loss. Orphaned at 12 and shuffled through the foster system, she had learned early that the world didn't owe her kindness. Yet she had found freedom in dance, teaching herself to move like no one was watching, cherishing stolen moments of joy in abandoned streets and quiet kitchens. When Alexander hired her, she had been nothing more than a name on a resume. Yet there was a subtle fire in her eyes, a defiance wrapped in humility that intrigued him unknowingly. Alexander stepped closer, the sound of his polished shoes echoing against the kitchen's marble floor. "You shouldn't be here so late," he said, his voice low but not harsh, carrying the weight of a man who had long measured every word. Sophie froze mid-spin, her hand lingering in the air, heart racing. I didn't hear you coming," she stammered, cheeks flushed. He studied her for a moment, noticing the slight calluses on her hands, the way she held herself as if balancing on invisible lines of grace, the faint tremor in her ankle. "You dance well," he finally said, almost as if testing the words on his own lips. A flash of memory struck him, the day Emily had danced for him in this very kitchen. Carefree, spinning with abandon before tragedy had stolen her away. Alexander shook his head, fighting the sudden ache in his chest. But it lingered. Sophie's movements, so full of life and risk, reminded him painfully of what he had lost. You think so?" Sophie asked cautiously, curiosity tinged with fear. She had never had anyone observe her like this, not without judgment or expectation. "Yes," Alexander said simply, though his mind raced. Could he allow this intrusion of life into his sterile mansion? Could he admit that her dance stirred something buried deep beneath years of grief and calculated isolation? Lila's soft voice echoed faintly from upstairs. "Daddy, can she teach me to dance too?" Alexander's chest tightened. The question was innocent, but it ignited a strange warmth he hadn't felt in a decade, a foreshadowing of bonds yet to be forged, of hearts that might thaw if he dared to open the doors fully. For a moment, neither spoke. The mansion felt simultaneously vast and intimate, cold and alive. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, indifferent to the fragile stirrings within the walls of Sterling Manor. Alexander wondered silently, almost to himself, who was Sophie really? And what would it take for her joy to survive within his carefully controlled world? Alexander lingered in the kitchen, the faint echo of Sophie's footsteps lingering in the marble corridor as if the walls themselves had absorbed her energy. He had always been a man of schedules, of precision, where every moment was measured and predictable. Yet tonight, the unexpected rhythm of her dance unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Sophie, once reassured by his calm gaze, let herself breathe. I only dance when no one's watching," she admitted, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying years of learned caution. She had survived by staying unseen, by blending into the background of a world that often punished attention. Yet something in Alexander's silence felt different, not judgment, but observation, as though he was deciphering a language only she spoke. Alexander leaned against the counter, eyes distant. Memories flooded him, the bright laughter of Emily as she twirled in this very kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes as she danced, and aware of the world's cruelty. He remembered the accident with painful clarity, the screech of tires, the shattered glass, the hollow echo of Lila's cries. Since that night, he had barricaded his heart behind contracts, corporate conquests, and control. Love had become too dangerous, joy too fleeting. But Sophie's defiance in motion reminded him of a light he had once treasured, a light he had convinced himself he no longer needed. "You've been here 6 months," he said finally, his voice low, measured, yet carrying a subtle warmth that startled even him. "I've watched you work. You organize clean. You do everything perfectly. Yet you move like this only when no one is here." Sophie's lips parted, a mixture of surprise and cautious pride. I've always danced. Since I was little. I never thought anyone would notice." A flash of memory appeared, her mother's gentle hands guiding her tiny feet on the floor of a crowded, dim apartment, the lullabies that smelled faintly of worn books and hope. Her mother had died young, leaving Sophie to navigate foster homes that treated her like property rather than a child. Dance had been her escape, her rebellion, her declaration of existence in a world that often ignored her. Alexander watched, captivated by the subtle strength in her movements. He didn't realize he had been unconsciously testing her all these months, allowing her small freedoms, noting how she navigated the mansion with care, observing the grace hidden beneath her practicality. He had never done this with anyone. His staff had always feared him, respected him from a distance, but Sophie intrigued him not with fear, but with life. "You're not like the others," he said after a long pause, his tone almost a question. "Everyone else obeys without thought. You make choices, even small ones. And yet, you survive." Sophie's eyes flickered, holding a trace of curiosity and suspicion. "You notice?" Her whisper barely carried across the gleaming kitchen. She wasn't used to being seen. Most people overlook the smallest details. "Yes," Alexander replied. "And I wonder why. Why do you move like this when no one is watching? What are you hiding in the shadows of your freedom?" Outside, the city lights flickered against the windows, indifferent to the mansion's sudden pulse of warmth. Alexander realized he had no answers, only questions, and that terrified him. Could this maid, this girl dancing in solitude, truly touch a part of him long buried? Could the walls of his world, built on wealth and loss, withstand the intrusion of someone so alive? Lila's distant voice called softly again from the upper floor, "Daddy, can she teach me to dance too?" Alexander stiffened slightly, a memory of Emily's hand on his shoulder, encouraging Lila's curiosity and joy, pierced through the armor he had spent years constructing. Could he let this happen? Could he allow life, laughter, and hope into a place that had known only control and silence? Sophie's soft smile returned, hesitant but genuine. "If she wants, I will." Her voice, layered with resilience, hope, and gentle courage, was a lifeline thrown into the icy mansion, slowly binding Alexander's fractured heart to something he hadn't dared hope for. And for the first time in 10 years, Alexander Sterling wondered if a frozen heart could truly thaw, and if it did, what storms might follow. The following morning, the mansion was bathed in golden sunlight, yet the air carried an unfamiliar tension. Alexander moved through the halls with his usual precision, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floors. But the rhythm of Sophie's dance from the night before lingered in his mind like an uninvited memory. He found himself pausing by the grand staircase, watching Lila chase a sunbeam across the living room, her laughter bright, unrestrained, a sound he had almost forgotten existed. Sophie entered quietly, holding a tray of breakfast, but she didn't lower her gaze entirely. Something had shifted overnight, subtle yet undeniable. Her back was straighter, her eyes more alert. The mansion had always been a cage of expectations, but today, it seemed to breathe differently. Alexander noticed it instantly. The way she carried herself suggested a confidence he hadn't seen before. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Sophie said softly, setting the tray down on the kitchen counter. Her voice carried the faintest trace of pride, yet laced with caution, as if she knew her movements were being scrutinized. "Good morning," he replied, voice clipped. Though internally he was unsettled, he remembered the days when Emily had served breakfast to him and Lila with smiles and warmth, their chatter filling the void of this massive house. He had almost forgotten how loud happiness could be, A memory surfaced and bidden Alexander at his father's office, a boy of 12, watching the elder Sterling close deals with ruthless efficiency. Weakness is expensive, his father had said, ice cold. Never show it. It costs more than money. That lesson had shaped him, carving the man who now stood silently in his kitchen, captivated by the quiet audacity of a maid who dared to dance in his world. You seem distracted, Sophie observed, placing the tray carefully on the counter. She had always had a sharp intuition, honed from years of observing without being seen. Her eyes, dark and knowing, lingered on him. Is something wrong? Alexander hesitated. Normally, he would deflect. Control was his armor. Yet something about Sophie's presence, her unpretentious strength, her quiet command of the space made him speak the truth, or at least part of it. I'm considering something, he admitted, the words heavy with more meaning than she could yet discern. Sophie tilted her head, curiosity mingled with caution. Considering? Yes, he said, eyes briefly closing as he remembered Emily dancing, Lila's tiny hands reaching for the air. Life has a way of forcing decisions. Sometimes, you realize there's more at stake than business, than money, than control. The statement hung in the air, charged with unspoken grief and a hint of vulnerability. Sophie sensed it, and though she didn't know the full story, she understood the language of loss and longing. Her own past whispered to her, the nights in foster homes, the friends she had lost, the lessons that had made her cautious but resilient. Then perhaps, Sophie began, a tentative smile touching her lips. The dance from last night wasn't just for yourself. Alexander's gaze snapped to hers. The subtle insight in her words pierced deeper than any boardroom strategy ever had. She was reading him, as she always did, a skill honed from survival and solitude. Perhaps, he admitted quietly, the word almost foreign on his tongue. Lila appeared at the kitchen entrance, clutching a small wooden figurine, her wide eyes reflecting innocent curiosity. Daddy, will Sophie teach me? Alexander swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. The memory of Emily, smiling softly as she encouraged Lila's every curiosity, resurfaced with a vivid clarity. Sophie, watching Lila, nodded gently. I will, she said. As the morning unfolded, Alexander observed the two of them together, Sophie guiding Lila's small steps, laughter filling the mansion's previously sterile halls. A subtle warmth spread in him, a foreshadowing of a bond yet to be fully realized. And yet, a question lingered, unspoken. Could he trust this freedom, this intrusion of life, to survive in his carefully controlled world, or would it shatter under the weight of old pain and hidden truths? For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling allowed himself to wonder, not about business, not about power, but about the fragile, unpredictable possibility of joy. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the faintest crack forming in the ice around his heart. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Sterling Manor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Alexander sat in his study, a rare book open before him, yet his mind wandered endlessly to the kitchen earlier. The image of Sophie guiding Lila's hesitant steps, her soft laugh mingling with the child's, refused to leave him. For a man who had built walls around his heart, this intrusion of life was unsettling but strangely compelling. Sophie moved quietly through the mansion, carrying a stack of laundry, yet her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted back to a small, dusty studio in her foster home, where she had taught herself to dance using a cracked mirror. Every pirouette was a defiance of loneliness, every step a whisper of hope. The rhythm of her own heartbeat had always been the music. Now, in this lavish mansion, her private rebellion had found an audience. Yet, she sensed Alexander's watchful eyes everywhere. The tension between observation and intrusion fascinated her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a mixture of caution and intrigue. Alexander finally rose, pacing the length of the study. He had always controlled everything: corporations, finances, even the smallest details of his household. But Sophie's presence defied predictability. How does she do it? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. How does she move through this world untouched and broken? A memory intruded, Emily laughing on a similar afternoon, her hand brushing against his as she guided Lila across the living room floor, teaching her to twirl. The memory was sharp, almost painful, reminding him of everything he had lost, and of the walls he had built to protect himself. And yet, Sophie through a simple act of dancing had reopened a door he thought permanently sealed. Sophie appeared in the doorway, pausing slightly, aware of his presence. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, "Leela asked me to show her a new move. She's eager." Alexander's eyes softened imperceptibly. "Of course," he said, his voice betraying a warmth he rarely allowed himself. He watched as Sophie guided Leela through a careful sequence, her hands gentle, her instructions precise yet nurturing. He noticed the way she adjusted her posture, how she communicated with patience and subtle authority, a reflection of her life's struggles and the resilience she had forged from them. "You were very careful with her," he said later, his tone curious, almost analytical. "She trusts you?" Sophie looked down, a faint blush on her cheeks. "I know what it's like to be alone, to want someone to notice you, even just a little. Leela deserves that." Alexander's chest tightened. He had never had anyone speak so directly to the truth of his own fears. Could he allow this young woman, so full of life and courage, into the fragile world he had built for his daughter? Could he trust her to remain a steady presence, unshaken by the mansion's grandeur or his own shadows? A sudden knock at the study door startled both of them. It was James, the longtime butler, his expression unreadable. "Sir, there's a visitor," he said, holding a folder that carried more than just paperwork. Alexander frowned. He rarely received unplanned guests. "Who?" he asked. James hesitated, a flicker of something unsaid crossing his face. "It's someone connected to the company's new project. They insist it's urgent." Alexander closed the book with a sharp snap. Sophie watched him, sensing the tension that always preceded a decision he hadn't yet made. There was a subtle foreshadowing in the air, the calm before a storm. The mansion's grand halls, filled with light and laughter moments before, now seemed to hold their breath. As he moved toward the door, Alexander allowed himself a brief glance at Sophie. There was something he couldn't yet name in her expression, an unspoken resilience, a hint of past secrets, a flicker that suggested she was more than just a maid. Could he read her fully, or was he only seeing the surface of a life shaped by hardship, defiance, and hidden brilliance? And as the door opened, the first ripple of change began. One that would test not only Alexander's heart but the fragile trust he had begun to place in the life he never thought he could welcome again. The visitor waited in the marble-floored foyer, tall and impeccably dressed, exuding authority that rivaled Alexander's own. Sophie stood near the staircase, silently observing, her hands gripping the railing lightly. She had learned early to read people. Every posture, every hesitation whispered stories. The visitor's confident stride hid something, a tension beneath the veneer of control. A subtle ripple that even Alexander, meticulous as he was, couldn't entirely mask. "Alexander Sterling," the visitor greeted, his voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested urgency. "I apologize for the intrusion. I come on behalf of the project board, but more importantly, I believe there are matters you need to be aware of, matters that affect more than just Sterling Industries." Alexander's brow furrowed. He had spent decades building his empire, controlling every risk, every outcome. Yet the gravity in the visitor's tone hinted at something beyond financial threats, something personal, perhaps connected to the legacy of the Sterling name itself. A flashback hit him, his father's voice, commanding and strict, warning him that every decision carried weight beyond immediate consequences. "Weakness," his father had said, "is never just yours, it affects everyone around you." Alexander's heart tightened with the memory. Sophie's presence nearby was a quiet anchor. She understood the delicate balance between observation and action, the subtle power of being both seen and unseen. Her own past, growing up in foster homes, learning to anticipate dangers before they arrived, made her hyper-aware of the tension in the room. Her eyes flickered toward Leela, who had followed Alexander downstairs, her small hands clutching Sophie's sleeve as if seeking courage from the woman she already trusted. "I understand," Alexander said finally, masking his unease. "Tell me everything." The visitor opened the folder, revealing documents and photographs that seemed innocuous at first glance but carried implications that tightened Alexander's chest. There were financial discrepancies, unusual transactions, and then a photograph of a woman Alexander didn't recognize, standing near a property registered under Sterling Industries but previously thought abandoned. A memory surfaced. Emily, years ago, had mentioned an old friend who had vanished mysteriously. Alexander had dismissed it at the time, buried in grief and business. Now, the past and present collided, the photograph igniting questions he hadn't considered in years. Who was this woman? How was she connected to the empire he had built? And why did the timing of this discovery feel like more than coincidence? Sophie, sensing the unspoken tension, stepped closer. Is everything okay? She asked softly, her voice cutting through the room's heavy silence. She had learned that subtle inquiries could uncover truths without confrontation. A skill forged in quiet observation and careful navigation of unstable environments. Alexander shook his head slightly, more to himself than her. It's complicated, he said. Sometimes the past returns in ways you never expect. The words carried a weight that Sophie intuitively understood. Loss, mystery, the burden of secrets held too long. Leela tugged gently at his sleeve. Daddy, are we in trouble? She asked, her innocence stark against the tension filling the room. Alexander knelt, meeting her wide eyes, and forced a reassuring smile. Not trouble, sweetheart, just changes. Sophie watched the interaction, her own mind racing. She understood trust, not the fragile kind, but the kind built through observation, patience, and quiet courage. And she recognized the subtle shift in Alexander Sterling, a man who had long cloaked himself in ice. The photograph, the documents, the visitor's urgency all foreshadowed challenges ahead. Yet it was Sophie's presence, her quiet strength, that offered a tether to stability amidst the storm. Alexander stood, a new resolve forming. He would confront the unknown, protect what mattered, and unconsciously allow the thawing of his own heart to guide his decisions. But questions lingered in his mind, haunting and insistent. Who truly threatened his empire? Could he trust anyone outside the walls he had so carefully fortified? And, most urgently, could he trust Sophie not just as a maid, but as a woman who had begun to pierce the armor around his frozen heart? The visitor handed him a final document, the edges crisp, the contents ominous. Alexander took it, his eyes narrowing. The mansion, once filled with light and the promise of new beginnings, suddenly felt the weight of shadows from the past, the present, and an uncertain future. That evening, the mansion seemed quieter than usual, yet the tension hummed through its walls like an electric current. Alexander sat in his study, the folder from the visitor open before him, the documents spread like a puzzle he had to decipher. He had faced corporate crises before, but the unease gnawing at him now was different. It felt personal, intrusive, a challenge to the careful order of his life. Sophie, sensing the subtle shift in atmosphere, moved quietly along the hall, carrying a tray of tea. She had learned long ago that in homes like this, patience and observation were her tools. Her past had trained her to read people with precision, a fleeting glance, a tightened jaw, the way someone's hands hovered over objects, waiting for decisions to be made. She placed the tray gently on the table beside him. Mr. Sterling, she said softly, you've been distant all day. Is something troubling you? Her voice carried no judgment, only a quiet curiosity that Alexander found both comforting and unsettling. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of his loneliness pressed upon him. It's complex, he admitted. Sometimes the past finds ways to interfere with the present. A memory surged. Emily standing on the terrace years ago, watching the sunset with a calm that seemed impossible in their chaotic world. She had been a balance he didn't deserve, a warmth that life cruelly tore from him. Alexander's lips tightened. That warmth now seemed mirrored in Sophie, though her world had been shaped differently through loss, resilience, and the constant need to survive. Sophie, sensing the gravity behind his words, remained silent. Her own memories whispered to her nights spent alone in foster homes, learning to guard her heart, yet dreaming secretly of someone who would see her not just her duties or survival skills, but her essence. Could Alexander see her that way, or was she merely another employee, another puzzle piece in a life she could never fully enter? Alexander rose abruptly, moving toward the window overlooking the city skyline. Do you ever wonder, he began, voice low, almost a murmur, why some people are given more grief than they can bear? Sophie hesitated, choosing her words with care. I think, sometimes the world doesn't choose, we do, or we survive anyway. And in surviving, we find parts of ourselves we never knew existed. Her response struck a chord. Alexander's mind flickered to Leela, laughing and twirling under Sophie's guidance earlier in the day. That laughter, innocent and unguarded, had penetrated walls he thought impenetrable. Could he allow this woman, so brave in her own right, to influence his daughter's life, to teach her joy, and perhaps unknowingly teach him to feel again? A faint sound drew their attention, the soft thump of footsteps from upstairs. Leela, wide-eyed, peeked into the study, holding a worn stuffed bear. "Daddy, can Sophie show me another dance?" Her voice carried innocence and trust, two things Alexander had long kept at bay. Sophie smiled gently. "Of course, sweetie. Let's try something new." She extended her hand, and Leela took it without hesitation. Watching them together, Alexander felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Yet fear lingered in the shadows, fear that this fragile happiness could be disrupted by forces he had not yet identified. He sighed and turned away from the window, realizing that life, unpredictably, had begun to weave itself back into his meticulously ordered existence. And in that realization, he noticed something he hadn't before, the faintest tremor of anticipation, not just in his daughter, but in himself. Could he risk opening his heart further? Could he let Sophie's light penetrate the darkness he had long embraced? A subtle sound of music drifted from the hall, Sophie humming a tune as she guided Leela. Alexander's chest tightened. The melody was a reminder of what he had lost, what he feared, and what he might yet gain. For the first time, he wondered if the frozen walls around his heart could finally thaw, and if they did, what consequences would follow for him, for Sophie, and for Leela. The evening air was cool, brushing against the windows of Sterling Manor as Alexander walked through the corridors, the visitor's documents still heavy in his hand. The mansion felt unusually still, as if holding its breath for what was coming. Sophie had finished helping Leela practice her dance steps and now moved silently through the halls. Her presence almost ethereal, a reminder of life that refused to be subdued. Alexander paused outside the grand library, running a hand through his hair. He had always controlled every variable, every business decision, every household action, but tonight, he felt the faint stirrings of uncertainty. The photograph from the visitor's folder burned in his mind, its implications growing sharper by the hour. There were secrets buried within his empire, shadows of past alliances, and someone or something was forcing them to the surface now. A memory struck him unbidden. Emily, years ago, confronting a supplier who had tried to deceive the company. She had been fearless, her conviction leaving a lasting imprint on him. Her death had left him bereft of warmth and certainty. But Sophie's presence stirred a long-forgotten echo of that fearlessness, a subtle challenge. A reminder that vulnerability could coexist with strength. Sophie appeared at the doorway, observing him carefully. "Alexander, you've barely eaten today," she said softly, concern edging her tone. "You can't carry everything alone." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them spoke volumes. Years of surviving hardship had taught her to sense when someone was balancing too much, when pride was masking a fracture in their resolve. "I don't usually ask for help," he replied, his voice tight. "I control everything. It's safer this way." He hesitated, glancing at her. But perhaps safety comes at too high a cost. Her eyes softened, reflecting both understanding and unspoken questions. "Sometimes the cost of isolation is far greater than the cost of trust," she said, her voice carrying a wisdom that belied her age. She thought of her own past, the nights spent hidden, surviving by reading intentions before they were spoken. And she recognized that Alexander's armor was as carefully constructed as her own, though built of different materials: grief, wealth, and fear of loss. A sudden knock at the library door startled them both. James entered, holding a discreet envelope. "Sir, this arrived. No return address." Alexander took it cautiously. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick, and inside, a single photograph and a short note. "You think you know who is loyal, but loyalty has a price. Watch carefully." Alexander's breath caught. The photograph was of Sophie, taken from outside the mansion. The image was candid and guarded, yet it was enough to provoke suspicion, a whisper of danger he hadn't anticipated. His mind raced, connecting dots from the visitor, the photograph, and his own unspoken fears. Could she truly be trusted? Or had his thawing heart blinded him to a hidden agenda? Sophie, sensing the tension, instinctively stepped closer. "Alexander, who is this from?" He shook his head, refusing to let panic surface. "I don't know. But he hesitated, realizing that despite the fear gnawing at him, he could not allow it to dictate his judgment. I need to watch carefully. Everything is connected. Every step, every gesture. I cannot risk Leela, or anyone else in this house. A flashback to Sophie's foster years passed through her mind, the constant vigilance, the careful calibration of trust, the painful lessons of betrayal. She understood the stakes immediately and silently vowed to prove, through her actions, that loyalty could exist without deception. Alexander turned to her, the first real vulnerability in his eyes since Emily's death. I don't know if I can protect them all, he admitted, voice low, almost a whisper. And yet, I can't let my fear control me. Sophie nodded, her own resolve firm. Then we'll face it together. For a moment, the mansion was silent, yet tension hung thick, foreshadowing challenges that would test trust, loyalty, and the fragile thawing of a heart long frozen. Outside, shadows deepened, and the city's lights flickered like distant warnings. Alexander realized that the real test had begun, not of wealth or power, but of faith in those he had begun to care for, and of courage to confront truths long buried. Night had settled over Sterling Manor, the moonlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, ghostly shadows across the grand halls. Alexander sat in the study, the photograph from the envelope still in his hand, a knot of unease tightening around his chest. The mansion felt suddenly smaller, as though every corner were watching, judging, whispering secrets he wasn't yet ready to confront. Sophie appeared quietly, holding a small notebook she often used to record household inventories and schedules, but tonight, it was a shield, a buffer against the tension thickening in the room. She had long learned to observe before acting, to weigh words carefully, to measure trust in microseconds. Her own memories surfaced, the foster homes where vigilance was survival, the brief betrayals that had scarred her, the tiny victories that had built her resilience. Every instinct screamed that tonight would require more than quiet observation. Alexander looked up, eyes shadowed by fatigue and contemplation. Someone's testing us, he said quietly. I don't know who or why, but they've already started. And they're close enough to know everything, even you. Sophie's stomach tightened. Her mind raced back to the photograph, the subtle angle of the camera. The timing, it was precise, calculated. Whoever had sent it was an amateur. They knew more than they should. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she maintained a composed exterior. I'll be careful, she said softly, though her own fears threatened to betray her calm. Alexander leaned back, his eyes distant. You've survived hardship before, he murmured. You understand vigilance. But this is different. It's personal. It's probing the cracks we hide behind. Sophie's mind flicked to a memory long buried, a distant relative who had disappeared, leaving her alone to navigate a world that offered no forgiveness. That fear had shaped her, hardened her, but it had also instilled a unique resilience. Now, standing in this mansion filled with wealth, power, and secrets, she realized that survival meant more than just caution. It required courage, trust, and, strangely, vulnerability. A sound broke the heavy silence, Lila's soft footsteps on the staircase. She appeared at the doorway, clutching her favorite doll, eyes wide and innocent. Daddy, are we safe? Her question pierced Alexander's chest like a lance. He had shielded her from grief, from the harshness of life. But now the threat was closer than ever, and he had no choice but to confront it. Yes, he said firmly, placing a hand over hers, but we must be careful. Some dangers aren't always visible. His gaze flicked to Sophie, a silent acknowledgement that he trusted her insight, her instincts, and her quiet strength to help navigate what was coming. Sophie knelt beside Leela, guiding her small hands to hold the doll tightly. We'll protect each other, she whispered, her voice firm yet soothing. And we'll face whatever comes together. A memory resurfaced, the first time she had comforted a terrified child in a foster home, promising safety despite the chaos surrounding them. That promise had saved her, given her purpose. And now it became a bond she extended to Leela, and, indirectly, to Alexander himself. Alexander watched, heart clenching, as Sophie's calm command seemed to anchor the fragile peace within the mansion. He realized then that trust was not weakness, it was a risk he could no longer avoid. Yet questions nagged at him relentlessly. Who was watching? How much did they know? And could any of them truly survive the truths about to surface? A sudden creak from the hallway made both adults freeze. The mansion, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. Alexander rose, moving toward the sound, instincts honed from decades of command and crisis alert. Sophie followed silently, every step calculated, every sense heightened. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Outside, the moonlight shimmered against the sleek lines of the mansion's exterior, indifferent to the storm brewing within. And in that silent, suspenseful moment, Alexander understood the fragile reality he faced. Power could protect, wealth could shield. But the heart frozen or thawing was vulnerable in ways money and control could never defend. Tonight would test them all. Loyalties, courage, and trust would collide. And one revelation, subtle yet devastating, waited just beyond the shadows, ready to unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves, each other, and the hidden dangers creeping closer. The mansion's corridors were dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls like silent witnesses. Alexander moved with deliberate caution, the visitor's documents and the mysterious photograph heavy in his mind. Every creak of the floorboards set his nerves alight, every flicker of light a possible signal. He had faced hostile negotiations, corporate sabotage, and ruthless competitors. Yet this threat felt different, closer, personal, and unnervingly precise. Sophie followed quietly, her senses attuned to the subtle signs of danger. Years of survival in unstable homes had honed her instincts. She could read people in seconds, decipher motives through small gestures. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow passing behind a doorway, and her pulse quickened. Whoever was testing Alexander was no stranger. They knew the mansion, the routines, the weak points. Alexander paused in the foyer, gripping the edge of the console table. "They're inside," he muttered, voice low, almost a whisper. "Someone's moving through the house, watching." He could almost hear the faint echo of his father's lessons: control, vigilance, and never let fear dictate your actions. Yet this time, control seemed elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. Sophie's gaze flicked toward the grand staircase. "We need to check upstairs," she said, her voice steady. "We can't let fear paralyze us." Her words carried authority, a reflection of the countless nights she had navigated uncertainty, protecting herself and others when no one else could. As they ascended, Alexander remembered a childhood memory, his father, ice cold, demonstrating that power was both a shield and a weapon. "Never let anyone see you hesitate," his father had instructed. The lesson had driven him, built his empire. But now, standing beside Sophie, he realized hesitation could also be wisdom, a measured pause before action. On the upper floor, the sound of movement grew louder. Alexander motioned for Sophie to stay behind as he moved toward the source, a partially open door leading to Lila's room. There, a faint rustling suggested someone had entered the child's sanctuary. His heart tightened. Emily's face flashed in his memory, the ghost of her warmth and laughter mingling with the ache of loss. He had vowed to protect Lila at all costs, and now that promise was being tested. Sophie stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Who's there?" she called. A shadow moved again, revealing a man in a dark jacket holding a small device, a security camera feed of the mansion. The intruder froze, caught between panic and purpose. Alexander emerged from the hallway, commanding presence filling the room. "Step away," he ordered, voice low and dangerous. "You're on my property, and you're endangering a child." His gaze bore into the man, measuring every twitch, every hesitation. The intruder hesitated, then raised his hands, eyes wide. "I wasn't going to, sir. It's not what it looks like," he stammered. Sophie, watching the exchange, sensed the layers of deception. This was not a simple break-in, but part of a larger scheme. Alexander's mind raced. This was the moment where control, trust, and instinct collided. He recalled Sophie's earlier words about courage and trust, realizing that she had prepared him to act not impulsively, but with precision and foresight. The past, present, and future intertwined. The stakes were no longer abstract. Every decision could ripple through their lives, testing loyalty, resolve, and the fragile thawing of his heart. Lila, now awake, peeked from the staircase, clutching her doll. "Daddy, is it safe?" Her small voice, innocent and pure, anchored Alexander's resolve. He glanced at Sophie, whose calm confidence reassured him. "Yes," he said, voice firm, though his mind whirred with strategies, possibilities, and threats. But we must be smart. The intruder's gaze shifted nervously between the three of them. And in that tension-filled silence, Alexander understood something profound. Wealth, power, and control could shield bodies, but hearts remain vulnerable. And tonight, the test of loyalty, courage, and trust was no longer theoretical, it was alive, pulsing in every shadow, every heartbeat, every decision made in that vast and certain mansion. The grand hall of Sterling Manor felt suspended in time, shadows dancing under the crystal chandeliers as Alexander confronted the intruder. Sophie stood close to Leela, her hand gently resting on the girl's shoulder, a quiet anchor of courage. The tension was palpable. The mansion, once a fortress of control, now seemed fragile under the weight of secrets and fear. The intruder, a man in his early 30s, trembled slightly. I was hired to observe, he stammered, the words revealing more than they intended. They wanted to know who you trusted, and if anyone inside could be influenced. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Who hired you? His voice was low, dangerous, carrying the weight of every lesson his father had ever taught him about betrayal. The man swallowed. A business rival. Someone close to the company. Someone who knew your weaknesses. But his words faltered under the intensity of Alexander's gaze. Sophie's voice cut through the tension, calm but commanding. And why are you here now? Why risk being caught? Her question wasn't just about logic. It was a probe into character, to see if the man's actions aligned with truth or deception. Her past instincts, forged from years of survival, made her the perfect counterbalance to Alexander's authoritative presence. I realized it was wrong, he admitted, voice shaking. Watching you, seeing the way you care for her, for your daughter. I couldn't do it anymore. His gaze dropped, shame and relief battling across his face. Alexander's chest tightened, the recognition of human complexity striking him like a blow. He had always believed trust was transactional, that loyalty had a price. Yet here was proof that morality, courage, and conscience could prevail even in the shadows of wealth and power. Leela, small and innocent, stepped forward, her eyes wide. Daddy, is she not bad? The simplicity of the question forced Alexander to confront not just the intruder, but his own heart. Could he forgive? Could he allow someone to redeem themselves in this house of carefully maintained order? Sophie smiled gently, placing a hand over Lila's. Sometimes people make mistakes, sweetheart. What matters is what they do after. Her words mirrored the lessons she had learned in her own past, the value of redemption, the courage to trust again, the strength and compassion. Alexander looked at the intruder, then at Sophie, then at Leela. His gaze softened, and a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. You're leaving, he said to the man, voice firm but not cruel. And you stay away from this house. But remember what you've learned here. The intruder nodded, understanding the gravity of mercy combined with warning, and slipped away into the night. As the door closed, the mansion exhaled. Alexander turned to Sophie, noticing for the first time not just her loyalty, but the warmth and resilience that had quietly begun to thaw the ice around his heart. Leela ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs, laughter and trust spilling into the space between them. Sophie stepped closer, hesitating for a fraction of a second, then meeting Alexander's gaze. It's safe now, she said softly, at least for tonight. Her voice carried reassurance, courage, and a subtle invitation to embrace something long denied. Alexander's hand brushed hers, an almost accidental touch that held more meaning than either had expected. The years of grief, control, and isolation seemed to dissolve in that fleeting moment. He realized that his heart, once frozen by loss and fear, was melting not because danger had passed entirely, but because trust, courage, and genuine connection had found a way in. A flashback surged, dimly dancing with Leela. Sophie humming a melody in the kitchen, the first steps of connection that had defied the rules of the mansion. Alexander understood then that life wasn't about total control. It was about embracing unpredictability, valuing loyalty, and protecting love when it arrived unexpectedly. Leela looked up at him, eyes sparkling. Daddy, can we dance now? Alexander chuckled, a sound rare and genuine, then nodded. Yes, we can. Sophie smiled, extending her hand. Alexander took it, and together, they guided Leela into the center of the grand hall. The three of them moved together, laughter and warmth filling the mansion for the first time in years. The frozen heart of a billionaire had begun to thaw, not with wealth, power, or manipulation, but with trust, courage, and the simple, profound act of seeing someone truly, deeply, for who they were. Outside, the night remained dark and quiet, but inside, Sterling Manor was alive, resilient, warm, and illuminated by a new hope. And in that dance, fleeting yet eternal, Alexander realized that love could break through even the thickest ice.